So we are heading to our last session, for its panel 8 in this entire conference. This is the moment where actually we will be looking ahead and see what actually is shaping the future of rebuilding macroeconomics, what macroeconomics has to offer after over 3 years of research and efforts. So we're very lucky to have this session led by Martin Sandbu, who would be in conversation with the director of Rebuilding Macro, Angus. And again, we're lucky to have another person here that has been doing a fantastic work in economics. So Martin, in my view, is the best, one of the ideal person to have here in charge of this job. For one thing, we all know how he is this amazing FT journalist, but also, there are much more to this. In my view, Martin treats economics in a much broader sense. It brings to economics the issue of ethics, of nature, of philosophy. And actually, I must say that today I was very impressed when I found out that Martin's dissertation is on how economic methodology informs common normative principles at the level of policy evaluation, and to what extent the economic way of looking at the world favors certain terms of political philosophy. So super. But I think the most important reason that we should be delighted to have Martin here is his most recent book on the economics of belonging, a radical plan to win back the left behind and achieve prosperity for all. And it's fair to say that, hopefully not planned, of course, Martin couldn't have kind of planned a better timing for that book. As we know, the pandemic has really challenged the question of resilience of our economy, the issues of inequality and inclusion, and that's a fantastic book to address these questions. Spoiler alert, we can't really blame globalization, according to Martin. So it's amazing to have him here, really pressing Angus to give us some more insights about the future. Before I pass the floor to Martin, I would like to do a bit of housekeeping again. Interact with us, drop your question in our chat box. Don't forget to choose the option for attendees and participants so everybody can read the questions. So without further ado, Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Carolina, for a wonderful introduction, but also to you and to Cecilia beforehand for sort of smoothly leading us into the topic of this end of conference conversation, which in the program is shaping the future. And I think that's something that probably ties together the themes you've covered all 3 days, both understanding social reality, methods for doing so, and your topic today of the culture of expertise. Where are all of those pointing, or should they be pointing as we go into the future? That's kind of what I want to try to pin Angus down on. So let's just go straight into it, Angus. Carolina hinted at how I'm very sympathetic to this whole program, having tried to have a pretty interdisciplinary, ecumenical approach in my previous life as an academic economist, short-lived previous life, but also a sympathetic skeptic, I would say. I think that's my role here today, to push you a little bit. You have a roadmap. A map tells us both sort of where we've been and where we're going. Why don't you start by telling us about the roadmap for this project of rebuilding macro?
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Martin. We don't have a roadmap yet, so the funding for rebuilding macro lasts until the middle of next year. And the task that we were set by the Economic and Social Research Council, who are the ones who fund us, is that at the end, we have to set out a roadmap which gives an account of where current macro is, what have been the most recent developments, but also a future path for macroeconomics which is complementary to the mainstream macroeconomics. It's supposed to complement the ESRC's existing investments, which of course are typical university investments and also in other research centers. So that's what we've got to write. It's an extraordinary privilege to be asked to lead writing that, I suppose, but also one that's slightly daunting. It's a big task. But as you can see over the last 3 days, I think we've got some very interesting building blocks to put together in working out what this complementary avenue for macroeconomics will be.
I'd like to spend a little bit of time on that. The conference, of course, this is a good moment to sum up what you think has come out of this conference, but maybe also in the context of the longer project, because this is, of course, not the only thing you've done. There's been a lot of work happening. So just can you just take a minute, just highlighting concretely what you think has been achieved in terms of insight, in terms of planning, in terms of understanding so far?
I think what we've seen in this conference is really a coming together of the work that we seeded over the last 3 years. So we got given this sum of money, and our job was to find and fund some research projects that were pilot projects. Now, the key here is we were supposed to find projects that may not be funded by conventional sources. So we're not trying to duplicate what's already there. We're not trying to do an epsilon away from what's already there. So we were deliberately trying to find different projects. And the SRC said they should be interdisciplinary and they should look at new methods. So we put a lot of research calls out, had lots of workshops, spoke to the public, had discussions about what was important, made these investments, and now the researchers begin to come back in. And I think what we've seen in this conference is many of those projects being discussed at their final or near final stages. So, for example, the first session was about social reality. It was led by Ekaterina Svetlova, who runs our finance hub, but Dame Henrietta Moore, who's on our management group and a grant holder. She was looking at her project, which is looking at qualitative as well as quantitative data to try and get at the sense that you know so well about belonging in some of the areas in the UK that have perhaps struggled relative to the rest of the UK. So look, very interesting collection of new data. Then Dennis Snow was trying to say, yes, but we also need to think about not just material side, but also our agency. We also have to think about the environment. So these other factors and social factors are bringing in other measures, aggregate sort of measures to look at how we're prospering. We then looked at some of how these issues matter in terms of when we think about the structure of the economy. So this is really thinking about groups. And this goes to really the heart of what we've been playing with. What is it that is the emerging big theme in all of what we've done? And I think if I was to say there's one big theme, it goes back to asking who we are as individuals. Are we really individuals? Are we only really relevant when we're interacting with other people? In other words, just as many people say, fish can't identify water because they swim in it all the time, we can't identify interactions because just like here, just like we've done in the last 3 days, just like we do in almost every living moment that we're awake, we interact with other people. And even when we're in our studies writing a paper, we're still going to interact with other people. And it's bringing that interaction into economics. So just that simple step can lead to a whole different approach to this. So that was really the founding part, this idea of bringing social and interaction absolutely central to this. It hasn't been something that economics has done over the last 70 years. You've tended to be very much, you sit at home, you fill in your excess demand function, post it off to the Valrasian auctioneer, he sends you some prices back, and then you go off and consume, but you don't interact. And the idea here is to get those interactions, and that takes us into a very different place. Day 2 was about where does that get you? What sort of new methods of analysis does that mean? And that's where we start looking at issues like areas that are called complexity, where one of the most interesting properties is that the aggregate outcomes aren't the same as just adding up all the individuals. And this is one of the most interesting areas, that the macro is not just the same as the sum of the micro. And so the idea that everything has to be micro-founded, we're sort of pushing away from that and saying, no, there's a better way of doing this. And it opens up much more questions, which we think have a lot of resonance with policymakers. And that's why I've had policymakers involved in the conference as well. So we have the building blocks of what I think should be an exciting program to put together, but it's still very much at this sort of developmental stage. And, it's going to be work in progress, I think, for the next, after this project, hopefully the next 5 or 10 years. And the previous panel, I hope a lot of the scholars will take this up and develop it much further.
So what I'd like to push you a bit more on is how this relates to mainstream macroeconomics, or the macroeconomics sort of as we know it, in several ways. Partly just intellectually, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions, and then get to the social interaction with the professional field, because I mean, you put it quite nicely that your purpose is to do something complementary to what's already done. Well, the risk, I suppose, is that instead of complementary, you do something orthogonal, to use the jargon, something that is just kind of going somewhere else, and that can be difficult to bridge intellectually. It can also be difficult to bridge socially, professionally, institutionally. But starting with intellectually. I mean, I share a lot of the sort of criticism people make of the standard methods. But let me try and understand better what your and many of your colleagues' criticism really comes to. Is this really an issue about methodological individualism being flawed? Or is it that we can do methodological individualism, but we need to get individuals right. We need to understand that they interact socially and so on. We need to bring their motives more in line with social reality. Because the answer to that, I think, will matter for how easy it is to talk to the mainstream of the field.
Totally agree. And, it's a very interesting question, the way you put it about how complementary you are. That's not necessarily the best thing, that we are very close to the field. To some extent, you want a diversification of ideas here. The world is changing pretty rapidly. And even just having differences of approaches and ideas is valuable, unless, you haven't been lucky enough to know, the absolute truth of the world, which none of us do, thankfully. It's not necessarily the case. You've got to be as close as possible. In answer to your question, which is a very, very deep one about methodological individualism, I think here in macroeconomics, if I'm being frank, what we are doing is pushing back on that. We're saying, no, not everything can be reduced to individual actions. It, of course, goes without saying that one wants to explain the macro by going down levels and levels and levels. That's natural to try and understand the mechanisms, completely understand that. But does the unit of analysis have to start with the individual? And there, I think the answer, the progress that we're making is not necessarily. There's many questions that need to be answered by groups, by regions. If you look at the industrial side, by smaller levels of firms or multinationals, it depends on the question you're answering. And if we're right that there are emergent properties, then it cannot be that you can reduce it right down to the smallest part. And in some ways, economics is slightly unusual with this insistence on always reducing it right down to the very smallest part. So it is, in some ways, a challenge. I'm not trying to sort of paper over that, but I think complementary is supposed to say, we want to stretch the boundaries and see what else can be done. Why? Because ultimately, these are important questions to try and answer about the world out there, because surely the end point, or the whole reason for doing macro, isn't as a pure science. It's not poetry. It's not just, for its own beauty. This is actually about solving some problems as well. And, we have a few of them. And so that means being side by side isn't necessarily the best way to do it. Being different, yes. The key is, can you start speaking each other's language? And I think Cecilia brought up about interdisciplinary. That's absolutely crucial. And this gets into your question. Let me just go straight into about socializing and so on. And this is a challenge. It really is, but it's a great challenge. And the challenge is to do it with as much honesty and openness and integrity as one can. I point out that the projects that we funded, we have, I think there 3 will be published as Bank of England working papers. We have at least 2 that I can think of that are actually representative agent models, because we thought they were different. So one of our representative agents is an artificial intelligence person, and we play around with information. It's different. Another one, we have 2 representative agents, and we have keeping up with the Joneses. So when I start looking at your consumption levels, there's your interaction again. So we are, there's crossovers here. And I think also in this dreadful crisis that we're going through, there's been some very important innovations in what one could call mainstream. network economics has been very, very important. In my view, the two best papers that have come out of this have been including networks. That's partly about interaction. It's a very static form of interaction, but that is certainly the right way to go. Heterogeneity has been mentioned. Heterogeneity, of course, is necessary but not sufficient for interaction. So it's a step, but it's not quite getting at what we have in mind. So we are complementary, but as I say, the idea is to push a new way of looking at macro for us to have different tools for different circumstances and different questions that we face out there. I don't think it has to be a monoculture.
So right. No, that's a really good point, that it shouldn't be a monoculture. But there's a question about how different you can manage to be and still talk to this sort of point of gravity of the field, the center of gravity of the field. So the couple of examples you gave at the end are all things that, they sort of fit, maybe on the margin, but within the margins of what the field at large is sort of comfortable with, operating with. I mean, I think of this a little bit. Look, here are kind of two challenges to you. We can think of one is we can think of this as sort of the behavioral economics model. We change the assumptions about preferences, we change the assumptions about cognitive capacity, but it's still the same style of modeling, really. So is kind of behavioral economics, is that the template for the sort of thing that you should be doing, or do you want something much more radical? So that's one challenge. And let me just add in the second one. This is more from the sort of policy point of view. I mean, you've kindly referenced my book. I've and I'm not the only one. Many of us have been criticizing macroeconomic policy as carried out in the last 10, 15 years in response to the crisis, especially, but even before that. But certainly my own experience has been that I can do that comfortably from within pretty standard economic tools, as long as they're used cleverly, creatively, and, beyond economism or 101 style economics that, of course, does prevail a bit too much in political debate. But I haven't felt the need to be very heterodox in order to make the sort of points I've wanted to make. And, let me appeal to Danny Roderick here, who talks about how the art of economics is to choose the right micro model for the right circumstances, because you can kind of create a lot of outcomes or a lot of conclusions with the same tools, depending on how you set it up. So these are a sort of intellectual and a practical challenge. Can you really do everything you want to do within these, within the margins of what the mainstream field tolerates, or do you need to be iconoclastic and go beyond?
Right. So let me try and first take your first question. Is this behavioral macro, or is this behavioral economics where we just change the biases perhaps that the agent has? We would say that this is not that. This is something else. That's
what I thought, yeah.
Yeah. So this is where we allow, say, preferences to change, where the interactions. So behavioral macro or behavioral economics can be done still in a very methodological, individualist way. It just means we don't calculate things quite as well. That's definitely not what we're getting at. What we're getting at here is these interactions between these agents, which make it key. So we would say that, Herbert Simon's famous bounded rationality notion, what was the bounded bit? It wasn't the bounded in your cognitive ability. It was bounded by the social context that people operate in. So, for example, last week, Robert Wilson was one of the Nobel Prize winners, and he's done a lot of work on game theory. And in game theory, there is interaction, no question. That's all they do, interaction. But they always get, you have to keep reducing it in this sort of infinite reduction problem. If you say, well, who set the rules of the introduction, of the interaction? Who kept setting those? And then you sort of come out with something like sequential coordination issues. But at the end, even he, happily accepts that we have made almost no progress on these foundational questions of where do the rules come from? Where do these social norms come from? Where do these issues come from? And so when you start asking those questions, you do start realizing this is actually different to just having a cognitive bias. So that's the first point. I think that it is different. On your second point about economic tools, I am with you on the breadth of economic tools. So I was very lucky while I worked in the Treasury during the crisis to be called upon to use a lot of the tools of what I'd call conventional economics, but they're not, nobody do a DSG model in those situations. It's impossible. But there were very conventional, there were tools by people like Ricardo Caballero about insurance models, Franklin, Allen and Douglas Gale about networks between interbank market players. Those were the key parts of the final advice that went to the cabinet at the end of 2008. My point in saying that is that there are indeed conventional tools that can be used to address many of these problems. I totally accept that. However, we would say that actually the things that we're looking at, we think might give you access to more questions than some of those. So, for example, crises, the way that crises tend to cascade. We don't have many models where they cascade like that without having, you need a structure to cascade, and structures have interactions. The sense of bringing identity into economics, it's pretty hard with standard tools that even Danny would be using. Resilience, we tend to optimize along one dimension in economics, and we know from physics that in a complex system, if we do that, we tend to have another problem in different dimensions. So it's giving us access to perhaps different questions, and that's why that's why I say it's complementary, because it's allowing you access to different questions, and that's not to try and knock or say that we're heterodox or fall into any of those traps of being labeled. We're trying assiduously not to do that. We're trying to say that we can actually perhaps make more progress if we're open-minded and look at other methods, which they don't contradict things. They're just complementary to the existing state of knowledge.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about how receptive those of a more conventional mind are to that. But first, let me share a little anecdote, because I had a conversation with a very senior policymaker in the European Commission not so long ago. It was after I wrote a piece about diversity in economics, both in terms of diversity in the economics profession, demographic and social diversity and so on, but also to what extent that helps us understand the importance of diversity in the economy, and in particular discrimination, structural discrimination, and so on. And this senior policymaker came back to me saying that probably what we need is to get better at getting proper macro foundations for microeconomic analysis. I thought that kind of chimes quite well with the sort of effort you're making. So that's a kind of encouragement that there are people high up in policy, at least the thoughtful ones, who will see the value of this. And in a more almost mercenary way, I'm sure that any policymaker, in the grip of a crisis, will leap at any model somebody can give them that actually explains what the hell is going on at the moment in a way that the conventional field often has been unable to do. But tell me what sort of reactions you're getting from the high priesthood, if you like, of academic macroeconomics, and also of the policy-making community.
Well, first of all, I should say that, we have a management group. It's quite fun. We have a management group. There's 5 of us. So I'm an economist. Roger Farmer is a very well-known macro theory guy. And then we have David Tuckett, who's a psychologist. We have Doyne Farmer, who's a complexity theorist, and Henrietta Moore, who is a social anthropologist. So you see, the economists are outnumbered. So it's been quite fun. Now, a lot of these views are my interpretation of it. The idea that we come to a consensus on all these matters, we don't. But have we together, I think, made some progress in laying down some building blocks for what we think might be what we put down in the roadmap? And I think there we have come to some agreement. And it's been very interesting to see how interdisciplinarity can be a way to work. You have to put it in the pressure cooker. You have to make people equal. You can't just add somebody from the outside. They'll get squashed. It has to be from right at the beginning. It's a very interesting method of cooking. Coming to your question about how we've been received, I would say in policy-making circles, we've actually had quite a lot of interest. So the new approaches to economic challenges at the OECD, and William Hines, who runs that, very kindly hosted yesterday. We have a lot of similarities there. There are other networks from places at NYU, places at Oxford, so other places in the world who've shown interest in forming more networks, also in continental Europe. So I think in policy side, but also in academic circles, in terms of the high priesthood, as you beautifully put it, there is work to be done there. There's no question about that. We're hoping that some of the papers that we've written, we've got a conference coming up with the IMF next month, that actually some of these areas people will think are interesting. Other areas they won't. Of course they won't. But that's kind of the nature of the animal that we've created. It's supposed to stretch people. But there is certainly a challenge there for how do we have a good dialogue with the high priests, as you put it. I think that's a very interesting challenge for us.
It's not easy, clearly. I mean, I can say in a way that maybe you diplomatically cannot, that of course the mainstream has a tendency to be imperialistic, but also the challenges to the mainstream often also have a tendency to go a bit tribal, partly in reaction. But it seems to me, that there's that old saying about how scientific progress or scientific revolutions happen one funeral at a time. And it may be that cultural change in economics or other academic fields happen one retirement at a time. So, in light of some of the things or some of the concerns that have been expressed today, maybe, what you're facing is a long march through the institutions. But I wish you luck, and hopefully one good thing that can come out of the many crises we're experiencing is that things can be a little bit faster than that. There's so much more I would like to ask, but all good things come to an end, and I think this is about the time when this conversation has to come to an end, and I will hand it back to you to bring the conference itself to an end. So thanks very much for inviting me, and great conversation. As I said, we could continue, and of course we will continue in other formats. So thanks again.
Super. Thank you very much indeed, Martin. Carolina, you and I can take this last piece. Thank you, Martin.
So thank you, of course, again, Martin, and thank you, Angus, for that. So we still have over 40 minutes that we can keep discussing things here. We have quite a few questions coming in here in our chat box that I probably hold a little bit because I would like you to talk a little bit more. And then I just would like to build up a little bit on Martin's, one of the answers you gave to Martin, if you could. You said, despite not having a roadmap very clear by now, Rebuilding Macro and its management team is very clear about some of the building blocks. You are building the foundations for the roadmap. So if you could spend a little bit on that, it would be great.
Thank you. So what I meant by we are still building up the roadmap. So you can imagine we've been running for 3 years. So it took us about, I guess, 6 to 9 months, maybe a year, to get most of the research to decide which projects we want to support, to get the hang of it. It's quite amazing, for our host institution, obviously, is NISA. NISA normally receives grant money. It doesn't give it out. And so we've, I think, funded 37 different grants. So that took quite a significant amount of time. And we learned, I think, quite a lot from that, which I'd happily sort of explore. And then, of course, the research takes some time to come through. And of course, then we had COVID. And so when a lot of the projects were expected to be finished, they've been delayed. I would say we have about a third of the projects finished already. Now, I have a pretty good idea, obviously, of what's going on in the others. But I think what we're going to be seeing over the next 6 months as these projects are finalized, we get them all through, a much more focused set of analysis about what are the common threads that run through these projects that allow us to put together the roadmap. But at the moment, what are the sort of building blocks? I'd say there's perhaps 4. One is interaction, which is something which I think is really fundamental to how human beings behave. I think one can all do a little bit of self-reflection and say, yep, that's pretty obvious. The next is social structure. Countries don't just go from individuals to the nation state. There are bits in between, whether it's, regions or by companies or by our social meetings. So this is the idea of bringing back in the mesostructure of the economy, where lots of analysis can and should take place there, but also how the various components fit together and move. And it's that move, this sort of evolutionary aspect of jostling around of different groups, that creates what John Kay and Mervyn King have so successfully written about: radical or fundamental uncertainty. In other words, things that don't have probability distributions. The idea that I think that this can be tackled from just saying there's exogenous shocks, it's just the wrong framework. And so internal fundamental uncertainty, in the sort of, using the terms of GLS Shackle, kaleidoscopic uncertainty, and how people make decisions. But first of all, you have to understand what the decision is you're facing. You have to try and understand the world that you're facing. This is where a lot of what was discussed in the panel yesterday with Diane Coyle and Paul Tuckett, David Tuckett and Paul Collier, this is where that comes in. So I think we also have this idea of structure. And then finally, two more. One is emergence, the property of emergence. I think we have now believed that the aggregate is not the same as the sum of the parts. And finally, I mentioned uncertainties. There's four: interaction, structure, emergence, and uncertainty, I'd say, are the building blocks of what we will hopefully be laying out as a complementary path.
Thank you very much, Angus. So before I let you carry on some of your thoughts, I would like to just throw in a few questions that are coming here. And I would like actually to make observation. There's a very interesting conversation going on here between the attendees and also Alan Kerman. So for those who are curious, just have a look at the chat box. It's a very, very interesting conversation. So we have a question coming from Caroline Bainton, which is how much has the pandemic crisis opened doors or catalyzed the project? Do you think the crisis has genuinely made economists / politicians / the public more keen to rebuilding macro? And actually, I will definitely take just that question, because I think there's a lot there that can be said, and hold the others that a little bit different for after that, if it's okay.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think that the crisis is obviously a tragedy, actually, but I think it has had the effect of leading to significant innovations in economics on a number of fronts. First of all, the data, we use data very fast now. Secondly, the way that research tends to be published, the VoxEU CEPR have turned around ebooks very quickly. I'm not sure, everything has to go that way, but it's been useful in the circumstances. But also, the idea when we set out of interdisciplinary research of using, bringing together different disciplines, was sort of thought of this a bit crazy. Now, bringing together epidemiological science with economics has become quite commonplace, which is great. So these, and also different ideas. So I mentioned networks. Networks have become a key part of a number of what I'd say were absolutely superb papers. I don't want to say any less than that. They really, really were first class. And what's been so interesting is they've given very different insights by bringing in this idea of networks. So I think there has been, in the face of this adversity, nature is the mother of invention. There has been a lot of creativity from what one might call mainstream or traditional economics. In terms of the sort of approaches that we're trying to pursue, in the past, when you say people interact, even though it's obviously second nature, this crisis has really made it utterly obvious, right? I mean, the whole reason why it spreads is because we interact. I mean, it's pretty simple. And I think it sort of takes us beyond doubt. We really need to start thinking about an agent not living in isolation. And I think in some ways it's made that very black and white, very stark indeed.
Fantastic. Okay, so I have another question here. And I think after these 3 days, rebuilding macro, many of us are wondering, okay, so how we do that, and how, and as academic macroeconomists, how can we survive? As we saw today, the monoculture seems to be something very alive in our field. And along these lines, I have this question from Oriol Valles saying, first of all, thank you, Rebuilding Macro, for this great conference. And a very direct question, but very important. Are there any journals that would accept interdisciplinary theoretical proposals to reconstruct macroeconomics for publication? And I think I would like to throw in that mix the discussion of how I may put you on a spot here. How Rebuilding Macro is actually dealing with that aspect of to get its message across, but also, the path to reconstruct macro, because it seems to me, as you mentioned to Martin, there was a lot of positive feedback from the policy level, not as much from the academic, crowd. So when you're talking about these 4 blocks in terms of foundation, I guess a broad umbrella is how we do that. So so I'd like to know if Rebuilding Macro has also give some thoughts on that.
Well, so let me try and the issue about publications. I think that what Daniel's done with exploring economics is absolutely extraordinary, and we are also going through a digital and technological revolution about how we do this as well. And so traditional journals I'll be frank, are not the route we're going to get publications, as the question asked, of looking at interdisciplinary approaches. I think that's going to be an uphill task. However, there are plenty of other ways of skinning a cat, to use an old English phrase, I think. So we had an e-journal that we published in, which went by the title of something like the Psychosocial something Foundations of Macroeconomics, which was, people thought we were slightly crazy doing it. I think that it's had about 12,000 downloads now for a journal, which is far more than many publications. And that's not to show off. It's just to say that there is a market. There is people who want to read this. Neuro was the other aspect. So I'm just not sure we need to go through the traditional sources anymore. I don't think that that's going to be a particularly productive way. I think it's probably going to be through other sources, and we'll see how that competition works out. I don't think there's a simple answer to this question. In terms of what we can do for that, I think a lot depends on what is the future of this project, Rebuilding Macro. We will take it to the roadmap. The question is, what happens after the roadmap? And that is really in the hands of our funders, the Economic and Social Research Council, other funders. It also the ideas that want to be taken up elsewhere. And this comes into the question I think Martin was getting at. I think, as I said, a lot of the ideas are, some are certainly getting interest with what one could call orthodox or mainstream economics. Others are not. And that was always going to happen. And I think until we get to that stage, we won't really know what the outcome is. What we really need, I think, is, it sounds a bit cheap to say it, but probably more funding. I think we need another 5 years to build this up. If I had my way, the way that we would do it is we would build a very substantial way of getting to the next generation, something like a very big summer school for a month, where we look at a lot of these methods and we really do our best to get the next generation, because they're the ones that are going to be taking this forward. And I think that's the bit that's missing. And I think that would be a very useful way of introducing people to these methods, but also for them to see them as complementary to the skills they learned in traditional programs. And, we are going through a computing and digital revolution where a lot of these skills now will be, programming skills and in object-oriented languages will become second nature to people coming through. So I think the science is also going to take us there. It's often said that the steam engine did a lot for science rather than the other way around. We've got the steam engine, it's called the digital revolution. We'll have to see what that does to science. And my view is it will lead to changes because we can do things today that we couldn't have dreamt of 20 years ago.
Thank you, Angus. I have a few more questions, but I think I would like to add here just half of one of the discussion that is happening here with Alan, where and he goes towards that point of publication, which he's saying, my suggestion would be to work on what interests you and not aim for the top journals. And of course, there are much more in the context of what he's saying. And there are comments coming here as well. Just out of curiosity, here, Mark Kirsten is saying to everybody, maybe the Rebuilding Macro audience find this panel discussion interesting, like we did with Alan Doyle and Eric Bainhocker, having a look ahead 30 years from now, titled Complexity Economics from 2008 to 2014. From 2008 to 2040, 40, looking ahead. So yeah, there's a link here. People can have a look at it. So okay, so I think it would be nice to give the audience a little bit of some insights or some ideas of what happens when it comes to these over 30 projects that Rebuilding Macro has funded. If you could tell us, because a lot of this was about being innovative, take risks and look beyond the traditional field of macro. So I wonder if there are a few of these projects that you'd like to highlight how interesting, as you as a macroeconomist, as someone who has a lot of experience at the policymaking level, but also in academia, what was for you that really got your attention in terms of this interdisciplinarity?
Thank you. That's an interesting question. Well, let me start off with ones that have been discussed in this conference, and I'll perhaps give you a little bit of background about how they came about. So Robert Mackay's presentation yesterday on trophic coherence or trophic incoherence, which really builds on food webs, which is the idea that, you have a lot of tigers when you have a lot of zebras, and you have a lot of zebras when you have a lot of grass, because one eats the other, which eats the other, and so on and so forth. So you have these food webs of different animals that eat different things. And the idea is that this is a bit like supply chains and economies. And so Robert's a mathematician, and he came along and presented this idea in his very modest way. And we thought, crikey, I'm not quite sure I understand what trophic coherence is, but this is kind of interesting. Doesn't it look a bit like a financial system? And so we started exploring it and say, well, what happens when you have animals that eat animals that are close to them? I said, oh, well, then a whole species, several species can just disappear, become extinct all of a sudden. They just collapse. They're very fragile networks. I said, okay, so that sounds like some sort of investment in securities firms in the global financial crisis, where one gets into trouble and the other one gets into trouble. And the key point is that the markets, the linkages between the different institutions become the key. So rather than just focusing on the institutions themselves, you start thinking about the links between them. And so it turns out that actually the financial structure looks like it's fairly trophic incoherent. In other words, it's quite fragile just by the way it's created. But then it comes to one of the questions that we asked right at the beginning of the project. So who asks the question of who's going to design the financial system? Do you just leave it up to markets to figure this out, or do we want to have an opinion? And that's one example of the project, which is clearly interdisciplinary, which fed through to have some pretty innovative ideas for what that might look like. Another one that I've mentioned already, which comes to mind, is a single representative agent, where this is a bit of work that's been done with the Bank of England, where we turn off the amount of information that the agent knows, and he bumps into similar agents which are the same, but then we start changing the information slightly, and we can only do this with really powerful computing. So it's basically an AI model. And the question is, at what point, how much information do you need to have as an AI agent to replicate this infinite horizon representative agent model? And it turns out that they can just bump into other people and discover the shape of the model. and discover the equilibrium path, but it takes about 200 years. So as long as you hang around for long enough, you'll see the fruits of it. So, there is another way, an interesting way of looking at, well, what can we do with this sort of model, and how can we use IE in these sort of interactions? So why I'm saying this, I'm just trying to think of a third one. So the third one, I guess Nick Chater's yesterday, also this tapping game. So why do our brains tend to cluster? So if I asked you, Carolina, to name 20 animals, we could do this experiment now. We asked you to name 20 animals. You tend to come up with a few, but then you start clustering very quickly on a probability distribution. We don't just sample across the distribution, we cluster. And then how do we go from one cluster to another cluster? And of course, this also looks like social interaction. It's how people form, and they take some of their expectations from different parts of the distribution. It's not so easy to say that we perfectly sample, we just don't. And then, of course, we've got a number of agent-based models. And the agent-based models, what's been quite so fun is many people think they're just computer algorithms, they're just computer systems. Actually, your agents in these models get together with other agents and they form little groups. They form what one could call social organizations in this. And you can actually simulate a lot of quote unquote what looks like to be social behavior by these agents. And they can prove to have areas of local stability, but then all of a sudden becomes unstable, or lots of different properties. And it's just the access to these different forms of analysis. And then you get to the debate of, okay, what is the decision-making rules for these agents? How do we decide what is the best decision-making rules? So it opens up a new set of tools as well. So those are the sort of projects that I think have been... Oh, can I just mention one more? We've a central bank digital currency, a major question where I have been... This has been with lawyers, and it's been an extraordinary exchange. And I think there'll be a working paper coming out next month, but that I think is going to be really quite surprising. That's been a really fun paper to do as well. So there's, we go from zoology, anthropology, computing science, economics, really quite a bit of breadth. I can see you looking at your watch. Are we running out?
No, I just wanted to give opportunity to to bring more questions in, and of course all these projects, they are available on the website. All of them, they have blogs, they have working papers. So so I'm sure people can also start digging into the Rebuilding Macro website to find out more. And actually following a little bit this, I have a very interesting question from Gary Deminsky. But before that, I wanted to mention something from Joseph Mogridge, hopefully I pronounced that right, which goes towards this, some of these fascinating projects and looking ahead. He's mentioning, speaking of outreach to the next generation, I hope that Rebuilding Macroeconomics could work together with Rethinking Economics. I think your description of a complementary approach could appeal to them. And I'm sure they would be very interested to hear about some of these projects you're working on. And I think this is very important because many students involved in Rethinking Economics movement, they are actually thirsty for different things. So I think it would be nice to have this, to work close with them. So I move to Gary Deminsky question, and if you want also to comment on the Rethinking Economics comment, you can come back to that. So Gary is saying it would be useful if Rebuilding Macroeconomics could have a conversation with the ref panel about breaking through the top journals' bias in their evaluation process. So a super important question, and sounds very difficult. This could help the young scholars, as well as your nice idea about a big summer school. And that is very, Gary Deminsky, he's very supportive to young scholar, as I can really vouch for it. So Angus, comments on that.
Sure. So first of all, rethinking economics. I think rethinking economics, but I don't want to focus exclusively on them because there's a number of networks that have been built up, I guess, mostly since the global financial crisis, often with younger generations, and please don't take that in any way as pejorative, motivating these things, and I think that they deserve all the plaudits they get. They do a fantastic job. And I think that you're quite right that we need to make more effort now that we have some of the outputs from the research, now that we're looking to the next steps to doing the roadmap. You're quite right that we have to do more interaction with those groups. So we are certainly an open door for doing that. In terms of Gary's suggestion about the ref panel, I was quite interested on Twitter a couple of days ago, something I don't usually get too involved in, but the science minister gave a speech and exactly about the ref, mentioning some of these incentive effects. And I've actually spoken, of course, I've spoken to many senior economists who really are the high priests, and they've acknowledged some of these. It's kind of a best kept secret. And so I think that is a good idea to try and have a discussion with the ref. Whether I can do that directly or we have to think of a right way to perhaps present Daniela's work, which is in particular about the ref, I think that's a very important suggestion. So you're right, Gary. It's not just about doing the research and then posting it in the letterbox and saying that's done. It's about doing the next step. It's actually about knocking on the doors and going to see these people. So dead right on that.
Thank you, Angus. Do you have I think I will insist on that second part of Gary's point, because I think actually it's quite important for young scholar, the question of summer schools. And if that's a possibility, I know it involved a lot of funding, but I think my generation is very familiar with the Minsky Summer School in the US. And how that not only brings a lot of interesting young scholars together doing different research, and how that actually shape our entire career. So to get rebuilding macro to kind of using all these findings and ideas to really impact the next generation would be important. Angus, floor yours.
Yep. Okay. Yep. Sorry, I thought Gary was going to come in. So look, the idea of a summer school depends first of all on what's going to happen to our funding. Let me put it completely blunt. I was sort of giving you what I would like to do next, which is have a sort of summer school where people go away for a month. This is not a small thing, where they get taught by some of the best in these techniques, and where some of these new ideas are presented and discussed and so on. I totally agree with you, Carolina. I mean, was it the Levy Summer School Institute that you went to? In those sort of years, it's extremely important what people get exposed to. And I think a month to learn these skills, crikey, I mean, with these developing digital uses, that's not to downplay the importance of a lot of the ethical issues in economics. But I think it's a wonderful idea for people to develop these skills. And that would hopefully be part of the way that you could open this up. So I would be completely supportive of it, but it really depends on what happens next in terms of our future funding.
Could I come in for a minute?
Of course.
Okay, so just to say, yeah, that if you look at the summer schools that have gone on, they've been so important. The levy was funded by the Ford Foundation for numbers of years, and so there was a kind of awareness based on the let's say Latin American and East Asian debt crises that was important. So that was one source there. Then in turn, the Post-Keynesian Economic Association has done one, which is depended on some subsidies from some of the participating universities, now all under stress. One wonders whether, as you say, it could be done. Ideally, you're completely right. A month together somewhere, I think, has been really a formative experience for some of these young people that have been such active participants in revitalizing economic discourse. I wonder whether in the post-COVID context, it might be possible to think of something that would be virtual and could be done on another basis. If so, maybe some of the younger scholars might be willing to join in a conversation about how that could be done and where one might. I know that INET perhaps could be a co-sponsor of that. They seem to have turned toward youth, their youth networks. And perhaps we could take a ride on that to some extent.
Angus?
Well, perhaps you could. These are discussions which have to happen. I think that the general point of the importance of thinking about the way we the education, the syllabus, core has been a wonderful project that people have been contributing to. What we're doing is slightly outside of that. I don't mean that in a sort of negative way, but the methodological approach in some ways is different. But that's been a great success. We have to think about how we build this into a wider network than what has been really a very diverse, but essentially an academic network so far. That's what it was set up for. That's who it's funded by. But we have to think about broadening that out, I think, in the future.
Thank you, Angus. Just again, to take the attention of everybody to the chat, there are a few options of summer schools being mentioned there. The Santa Fe Institute has an excellent summer school. There is also the Ankadad YSI kind of week-long summer school. So yeah, so there's a lot going on out there as well, and also in our chat there's some exchange of papers for those that are interested in all these we've been discussing. But I would like to take our attention. I know you're very tired, but there's an excellent question coming up from Mary Morgan. So be ready, Angus. So here we go. And also, before I actually read that question, I can see that, again, Alan Kerman is really interacting here. I'd like to invite him the same way I invite Gary. If he would like to step in and contribute, would be amazing, actually. So here we go, Mary Morgan's question. Does the project have the possibility to unpack and rethink the characteristics of what counts as an economic agent in a way which is more relevant for different meso levels? Example, what characterizes the economic agent called a firm? So no pressure.
So Mary is a friend and has been very generous in her time in helping us think through some of the issues in rebuilding macro. And this question really gets to what was discussed on Wednesday, where she very generously chaired one of the sessions. And the question is about the social structure. When we look at the social structure and think, what are the agents? What is the right way to look at an economy? Now, in macroeconomics, you tend to go C plus I plus G plus X minus M. What are you talking about? That's all there is. Actually, there is so much more when you think about it. We've kind of ignored the spatial sense of this until about, I guess, 10 years ago, maybe a bit less. But there's also the industrial structure of this. We used to talk about industrial structures all the time back in the earlier days. And here there's the idea that, we go from being a single function, perhaps self-employed, to then perhaps having a partnership or something slightly bigger, to then a single process firm, to then a multiple process firm, to then perhaps even a multi-regional firm, and then, of course, to a multinational. So you can see that there's already an ecology of different levels of firms where changes in process right down at the bottom can have effects right at the top as well. And it's these changes at the smaller levels that have these ripple effects onto the bigger firms, which is really what we're talking about how economies reinvent themselves as almost a dynamic process over time. So I think that looking again at what we used to call industrial structure and trying to make more use of thinking of the macroeconomy that way might get us a lot further, particularly with the changes that are coming through technology. So I do think that's a very promising area, and one that certainly plays exactly into this idea of having economic structures rather than just being flat or macro, and nothing in between. Alan, I can see you there. I would certainly welcome you to come in.
Oh, thanks, Angus. No, there have been a lot of interesting things here, and Mary Morgan's comment, I think, is very appropriate. When you think about it, we start out in economics and we teach our students that there are two types of people. There are producers and consumers. Well, you probably never actually met a producer because they aren't usually individuals. But consumers, what a horrible way to present a human being. Just as a consumer, all he does is sit there and eat what the other guys produce and produces waste afterwards. I mean, it's a really miserable vision of how human beings are. And I'm happy that we've moved on a bit from that. But just to be one remark to you, Angus, was you were talking about looking at individuals and how this a representative individual. But a long time ago, Marco Lippi and Mario Forni wrote a book on macroeconomics where they said, look, if you do econometrics with just one individual, you have to distort what he does in his lifetime so much that it's just not realistic. But if you put in two more simple people and put in three more simple people, all of a sudden, this starts to be much easier to fit and much more plausible. So they already were on that road a long time ago. So I think that's another interesting point. And the thing, to come back to Mary's point, talking about firms on the other side, you remember that there was this huge debate with Oscar Lange over socialist planning against market and the debate between Lange and Hayek and company. And Ronald Coase stepped into that debate and he said, you know, what is very strange is that people here are criticizing centrally planned economies, but most of our economy is run by big firms, each of which is a little central planned economy. And people were very resentful about that. But I think that he was right on the mark. And the point is, you're absolutely right that at every different level, there are different groups, different clusters, different organizations. And if we don't think of it like that, then with this sort of ridiculous individuals producing on one side and consuming on the other side, and that's all there is. That's a very, very frustrating view of economics. So I think my main message to you, Angus, is that you're doing a great job on rebuilding macro, but it really needed rebuilding. So I think you're right on the right step, and I just hope that they will continue to fund you. And the idea, last remark, the idea of having a big summer workshop with lots of people there for a summer school for a while, that's been very successful in other disciplines too. In physics, they've had wonderful ones, and in biology too. And I went to one in Les Houches, just near Chamonix, a beautiful one, run by Jean-Philippe Bouchot and the guy who's now head of the École Normale. And it was great. You know, we spent 2 weeks there together, and everybody was talking to everybody else, and it was great. So I really think that's a great idea. I don't know where to do it, how to do it, but maybe the OECD might be able to help with that. So I'll talk to William about that. So anyway, congratulations again, Angus. You're doing a great job.
Thank you very much indeed, Alan. I think, Carolina, we should probably draw this to a close.
Yes, of course. I was about saying that before.
Over to you.
My cherry, but thank you, Alan, for your intervention, and Gary as well. In this reach, the questions from the audience, this chat. I hope you can save that because it's just a rich conversation going there. Mary Morgan for also having participated. So yeah, I think I can definitely bring all this discussion to end. Angus, I assume you would like you to do any final remarks, or you're good, or.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Gary, and thank you, Alan, both for coming in at the end. It's great to see you both. But there's, Carolina, thank you very much indeed for your expert hosting today. It's a tough job, and I know you've done a superb job, so thank you very much indeed. Now, I sort of get praised a little bit because I'm the director of this project. But of course, it's not me. We have a management group, and I've mentioned them already. Join Henrietta, David, and Roger. But also a small group at NISA who works on this. Richard Arnold, he runs 37 research projects in terms of the funding and all the contracts that have to go behind that. does an extraordinary amount of good work, and this genuinely could never have happened anywhere near like this without him. And then we tend to have somebody who's about to go off to do their PhD. They spend a year with us. So Gavin Hassel was last year, and Carla Koberger this year, who's been operating most of this conference. And National Institute, who are our host institute, we're extremely grateful for the support that they've given us. The Economic and Social Research Council, who have funded us, and we're very, very grateful for the courage they've had to make this sort of commitment to fund a project like Rebuilding Macroeconomics. And also all of you for taking part in the conference. It's been terrific. I'm very, very pleased with it. I hope you've enjoyed it. And my final thanks is to all of our friends out there and our colleagues and supporters. We are extremely grateful for your ongoing support and encouragement. So thank you very much indeed. And I wish you all a very good weekend. And please do stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Angus. Thank you, everyone. For more information, please visit the Rebuilding Macro website. And yeah, we hope to see you soon, all of you online or not, or perhaps in a summer school. Who knows? Thank you very much. Bye-bye.